In this video, we're going to go over data protection as it relates to the plan, protect, respond cycle. So what is data's role in business, and how does security impact this role? So data is very critical to any business that operates today. If it is compromised at all, it could mean drastic consequences for an organization, such as loss of brand image. It could lead to a loss of customers, and so it's vital that we protect our data in a business. So security is very integral to data, because without proper security in place, we hear of breaches all the time in the news. And we constantly hear of them. It seems like on a daily occurrence, we hear of a new breach that has occurred. And this affects small companies to large business corporations. So what are some of the threats to our data? Well, let's just talk about the server environment and how we get to the database in the first place. So typically an organization will have a database server. The predominant ones are Oracle, MySQL, and SQL Server. And then you'll have an internal firewall that will protect any hackers from entering inside the organization. And then between the internal firewall and what we'll call a border firewall, we have a middleware server that's going to be kind of a back-end server that's going to run some processing logic that either interacts with the database or just returns results based on users' interaction with the web server. We have a web server that is primarily hosted by Apache. Microsoft IIS is another option. And then we have the border firewall that I was talking about. So the web server and the middleware server typically fall within a DMZ, which is the demilitarized zone. And then we're going to have a browser, which is going to try to connect to the web server. Any interaction with the web server, such as a form, is going to then interact with the middleware server, such as PHP, which will then interact with the database if it needs to call the database. So what are the threats that could occur in this representation here? Well, first, on the database server, we could have overprivileged accounts, meaning that some users have been granted access to the database directly, but they weren't restricted on their level of access. Maybe they were given full access to the database, which could lead to many issues. This could either be because the individual retaliates against the organization, or maybe their computer is compromised because they're downloading stuff that they shouldn't, and then a backdoor is added onto their device, giving hackers direct access to the database. Another threat is weak permissions. So maybe we define the permissions that a user should have, however, we haven't properly specified what these permissions should be. And so a user gains access to a table that they shouldn't, or to a view that they shouldn't, etc. When it comes to the firewalls, both the perimeter and the internal firewall, the biggest threats we have here is open ports that shouldn't be open. Just think of a door that is open and unlocked, and anyone could walk into it. If we have ports that are open and anyone is able to get in through that port, then we have the potential compromise of our database. We have eavesdroppers that could be man in the middle, basically capturing all the information as it's sent across the network and doing something with that information. When we get to the middleware server, such as PHP, again, we have the issue of overprivileged accounts. So for example, let's say PHP had direct access to the database, and we use the PHP application to log in to the root account of the database, rather than to log in to a specific user that has restricted access. So we may be controlling the access to the database, but if someone compromises the PHP application and we've given the PHP application root level access, all of a sudden they have root level access to the database. Also, improper form validation is a huge issue. So what does this mean? A lot of companies will rely on entry in the web server itself, such as forms and reports. But the biggest problem is if you rely on the web server, what's going to happen is someone can manipulate these forms to send in any value to the database or to the backend that shouldn't be sent. Even if you have JavaScript validation or any other validation on the client side, it can be manipulated with. So the middleware server is going to have our backend languages, and they're going to evaluate this code to make sure that the entry into the form has fallen within valid parameters. On the web server, we are going to manage access controls, so not everyone's going to be able to access certain pages on our web server, so we need to have password and session management to protect against that. We also need to protect against SQL injections, so we need to be able to prepare the statements, so not relying on the client to enter what we would think they'd enter into the form, but rather assume that any person out there could maliciously use our forms to gain access to the database. So what does this mean to have a prepared statement? It means that we're going to escape all the quotes so that no one can manipulate the query to be able to do something other than it is intended to do. Another issue with the web server is denial of service attacks. So just overloading a web server with so much traffic that no one else can gain access to our web server and essentially the data in our database. And again, the perimeter firewall, we have ports that could potentially be open that could lead to compromise. And so all of these are examples of something that can enable a hacker to gain access to a resource that we don't want them to gain access to. So what data should be protected against data loss? So we have date last voted, zip code, diagnosis of maybe a medical condition, medication, procedure, gender, etc. Take a few seconds and decide which of these should be protected against. I hope you said all of it, and the reason why all of it should be protected is because of something called triangulation. So we have here all the data from the columns that were just represented on the previous slide. And we have medical data that is grouped together. We have voter list data that is grouped together. What we can do is see that each of the medical records are associated with similar data from a voter list, which is public data. So for example, a zip code, a birthday, and gender are similar across both of these types of data. And so if someone is able to have access to the medical data and the voter list data, they could potentially find out exactly who has all this medical information, therefore being a huge HIPAA violation. So if you think about it with a triangle, every triangle adds up to 180 degrees. So if I have two corners with the degrees of 55, I'm going to add those up and I have 110. And so to find out what the last corner is going to be, I'm going to subtract 110 from 180, and I would get 70 degrees. Another thing that we can do to ensure that our data is properly protected is to encrypt it. So this either includes file directory or whole disk encryption, so just encrypting certain directories to ensure that that specific information is protected. We can have whole disk encryption, meaning that you'd have to be able to log in to be able to decrypt it and view any of the information on the drive. And all of this is going to be protected by a key. We got to make sure that this key is well protected, because if we lose this key, we essentially lose all access to our data. So a specific instance of something with regard to this key is one time I backed up my whole disk and I forgot that I had encrypted it all before I backed it up. I then upgraded my operating system and I went to retrieve all the files and they had been encrypted. But since I changed my operating system, it came with a new key, and so essentially I lost all those files because I no longer had the key to decrypt those files. We also want to make sure that we have strong authentication and maybe multi-factor authentication to ensure that no users can gain access to this data. So we're going to show you how to encrypt a specific file. So what I want you to do is follow the instructions on this slide. So go ahead, pause this video, and then do this on your own, and then we'll come back for a discussion. Okay, so here I am in the file directory. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new text document. We'll call this test.txt. I can then right-click this file, go to Properties. I then click this Advanced button. And then what we're going to do is encrypt the contents to secure data. Click OK, and Apply. Okay, encrypt the file and its parent folder. Okay, and then we go ahead and click OK. And we can see that there is a little lock icon next to this. Let's show this with a larger icon. And so you can see there is a lock icon here. And in fact, when I encrypted it, I actually encrypted the folder itself as well.